Hi, so welcome to the Seed Saving in a Time of Change, Ancient Practices for Modern Times. I am Rebecca Newburn, and I am delighted to have Julia Dakin with us today. We'll just talk a little bit about who we are, and then we'll kind of jump right on in. So I started the Richmond Grows Seed Lending Library and also founded the Seed Library Network. And I'm super excited to have Julia Dakin joining me with this class. I created this class during the pandemic when there was such a need and interest in having seeds, and there was a very big shortage. If you were trying to get seeds, you know that. And this kind of just try to help people fill that gap when people were a little bit at home and didn't have seeds and wanted to do something in the soil. So Julia Dakin is an amazing farmer, activist, and she co-founded the Going to Seed project. But I feel like for myself, it is one of the most powerful pieces of work that is happening on the planet. So I'm really excited to be having Julia here. I think it's just amazing what she's doing and the work that Going to Seed is doing. So I'm really happy she is joining us today for this class.
Thank you. My pleasure.
It is mutual. So first off, I want to give a big shout out, as those of you that have been with the Seed Library Network for a while know, we are 100% volunteer organization. So everything you see that's been done here has been created by volunteers, promoted by volunteers. We are committed to having all of our resources offered for free. And so we appreciate donations from the community to keep the work we're doing. And then we also are really grateful to partner with the Experimental Farm Network for this class. They are incredible. They're not only a seed kind of house that offering really genetically diverse seed. I get a lot of for example, I love okra, but we have a really cool coastal California climate, so I can't grow okra here, but I bought their landrace okra with the hope that this year I might actually get okra growing. So they have a lot of very interesting genetically diverse seeds. So you can see one of their kale offerings, beautiful. And they also have a learning community because they understand that in order for us to really meet this moment in terms of climate change, it's going to take a lot of people getting their hands in the soil and saving seeds. And so they have this amazing community where people are doing projects, and you can jump on someone else's project or create your own project in terms of climate adapted and genetically diverse seeds. So really awesome that they're partnering us with this, and want to just give them a big shout out. So we're going to talk a little bit about just our seed journeys, seed libraries. So while anybody can save seeds, we obviously want to tailor this a little bit more towards seed libraries today, so that you can kind of see some of the options you might want to consider with your own seed library. Once again, if you're coming into this class, we are recording it, and we will be offering this available as well as the slideshow. So it's a lot of content that we're going to be going through. So we will, at the end, we'll send you the slideshow. We'll send you some list of resources so you can kind of follow up on your own. So kind of what we're going to be talking about today is resilience in a time of change. So there's lots of change going on with climates, with availability of seeds. We'll talk about what is a seed, the importance of seed saving, as well as knowing why you want to save seeds. So if you understand your why, that'll help you kind of choose your own adventure in terms of, are you trying to preserve heirlooms of the past, breed heirlooms of the future, or create genetically diverse mixes that might be more resilient in crazy weather events. So those are some things to consider. And then we'll talk about just some seed saving techniques for different common vegetables, everything from pure seed and kind of keeping it true to type, or mixing it up, and when you might want to do one or the other. So some of you may be familiar with this graph, and it really kind of visually highlights what has happened with the genetic diversity at least in the United States here. So it shows in 1903 the number of varieties of lettuce you could find in commercial seed houses. And then kind of fast forward 80 years later, and you can see, how much that has changed. And many of those, and you think about it, it's not just what was offered in commercial seed houses, but how many people lived on farms, had heirlooms, or heritage varieties that were important to their family, moved to the city, and we lost all of that too. So there's been this huge kind of bottleneck of genetic diversity. And so that diversity is going to be saved by individuals like you in seed libraries like yours, instead of, expecting large companies to be housing things that are genetically diverse and culturally relevant to you as well as adapted to your climate. So really it's important for the community to steward their own seeds. And so this is another kind of contextual piece that can help out, which is seed diversity and who owns those seeds. So this is kind of the mix of this global seed consolidation between 1996 and 2013. Once again, we will be sharing the slideshow with you. So if you can't see everything right now, don't worry about it. You'll have access to kind of being able to like zoom in and see stuff, as well as go to the direct link for this professor and the work that he does. So you can see like Monsanto and DuPont being really large leaders between, in this era. And then, in not a short order of time, 2013, sorry, and then, 2018. And then you can see Bayer is kind of, taking over this large thing. So 70% of the seed and agrochemical industry is in the hands of only 3 merged companies. So ChemChina, Syngenta, Dow, DuPont, and Bayer Monsanto. So, the question is, these are agrochemical companies, so they're providing chemicals that work with their products, and maybe that's not the best fit for what we want in terms of nutritious food. Maybe we want to be growing food that's nutritious or that's delicious, as opposed to things that really support the chemical products that they're offering. And Julia, this is a slide. Do you want to talk a little bit about this one here?
Yes. So a lot of places have done a really great job with local food, right? Farmers markets have exploded, especially over the last 15 years. And especially in my county, people are really proud of shopping at the farmers market. And that is great and super important. But it has to just be the first step, right? Because we just rarely think about as consumers and farm supporters and local food supporters and seed libraries that it's local food, but it's not adapted, with it require these crops a lot of times require that extra support, the remake covers, all those things that are polluting. They're not good for our soil, they're not good for us, and we really need to take the next step in the future with local seeds as part of the local food movement.
Awesome, thank you. So a climate and food system in crisis. So as you saw in this, the slides ahead of time, there's this huge loss in genetic diversity. There's a huge concentration of what is left in the hands of very few. Much of the US, as Julia just pointed out, much of these US farmers, whether it's your farmer's market or the produce you buy is seed that's being grown in other bioregions, often even in other countries. And, as a result, that's leaving us, with climate change, there's going to be an increase in pest and disease pressure, as many of us are seeing, whether you're watching the news or just in your own hometown, erratic weather patterns, more extreme weather events, increasingly a hotter planet. So here we've got this, climate and food crisis going on, and how are we going to respond to it? And the best way to do it is in community, with all hands in the soil and talking to each other and sharing best practices and discussing what's working and what's not and how to kind of move forward. So that's kind of what this class is about. Now, I grew up in a household where my mom is a major gardener, and while she's a major gardener, she never saved seeds until I started the Richmond Grows Seed Lending Library. So why do a lot of people not save seeds? Well, it's really easy to get seeds, unless of course you try to get seeds at the beginning of the pandemic and couldn't do it. It's easy to get starts. What happened one year was I kept telling her, you should save these peppers. You should save these peppers. I'll tell you how to do it. It's not that complicated. She's like, oh, I can just go get them at Frank's nursery. And the next year they stopped carrying that pepper and she was devastated. And I'm like, you're lucky that happens to be a rare variety, but I have it in my collection and I gave it to her. And now she's a pepper saver. So it's a good thing to, once again, if you have control in your own community over these, then you will have access to what you love and appreciate and can share it with other people. So another reason why a lot of people, gardeners, don't save seeds is they're confused or they lack knowledge. There's a lot of anxiety around, I don't want to mess it up. For example, you get that compost pile pumpkin and you're like, that is like nothing I've ever grown before. Where did it come from? And concerned about wanting to save pumpkins or some other crop because you're not sure how to do it or what's going to happen. And sometimes people don't even consider it. It's just not on their radar. When we started this Richmond Grow Seed Lending Library, people were like, well, how do you lend seeds? And it was like, well, you've got to save seeds and then you can return some. And people are like, oh yeah. So I think it wasn't, a lot of people have lost that as part of their gardening practice. And we're just hoping that to inspire people to kind of pick that up again and do it in community and kind of help each other along the road. So, and I mentioned the weird pumpkins coming out of the pile. So let's get started. So the purpose of this class is to really have you feel like you can do this. So you can save seeds. We have been doing it as a species for a long time. We want you to feel empowered and equipped to save seeds from your garden and grow more food. Obviously in the process right now, I mean, with seed packets being expensive as they are, and you like to grow stuff, it can get quite expensive. So it can save you a lot of money. And then the other thing is when you are a seed saver, seed savers tend to be really generous. So, this here is just like, 2 lettuce plants and I have a lot more of them, but it's like, that's a lot of seed that can feed a lot of people. So seed savers often will give their seeds away because there's more than they could possibly use. And sometimes that has been really advantageous. So I've shared some really rare varieties with friends and then I lost it and I was able to get it gifted back to me. So it's, to our benefit when we share, it helps the people in our community, and sometimes it can help us right back in return. And then know your reason for saving seeds. So sometimes you might want to be preserving something that's really special. Sometimes you might just want to be growing food and it's not really as important about the variety. So having a sense of what your why is going to really help you determine when you start to save seeds, what you want to do and what you need to do in order to kind of get the seeds that you're interested in. And then in terms of, being with all the weird weather events and warming up planet, lots of different things. So diversity is one of the mantras. The other mantra in this process is going to be label. So you know what you have. And when you share the seeds with other people, you have a good sense of what you are sharing. So we're going to kind of do this through a who, what, when, where, why, and how process. So first off, where do you get seeds from in a beet? So a lot of people, like some seeds are rather obvious. You look at a squash, it's really clear where the seeds are. And when it's a mature squash, like a pumpkin, those seeds will be viable. Like tomatoes, it's very clear where the seeds are. But something like a beet, the issue is that we often don't let those plants go through their full cycle. So we never actually see the beet flower and mature and turn to seed. And quite honestly, with beets, it's a little bit of a process because it needs to overwinter. If you live in a climate where the soil freezes, you even need to pull those beets out of the ground and replant them. So beets can be quite challenging if you live in a cold climate. But basically the point is you've got to let those plants go to seed. Same thing with the lettuce. People tend not to see lettuce seeds because we pull them out as soon as they start to bolt. So if it contains seeds, it's a fruit. So zucchini, cucumbers, tomatoes, those are all botanically fruits. And saving seeds from fruit-bearing plants is, as I mentioned, much more straightforward because you can locate the seeds. And once again, if you're pulling the seeds out before you let them flower, you're disrupting that cycle, which also impacts pollinators and other things in many cases. Not that all plants require pollinators, but it can kind of provide some insect food as well. So when are the seeds of the fruit ready? So you save the seeds from completely mature fruits. So melons, winter squash, tomatoes, peppers, when they're mature. We often eat a lot of things in an immature phase. So for example, the zucchinis and cukes and eggplants, we eat them when they're young and the seeds are not mature. So in order for a cucumber to be mature, it's going to get really large and yellow and brown. I mean, the eggplant, same thing. You would not want to eat an eggplant when the seeds are ready. So they go, and you should see the zucchinis that I'm growing. I mean, my zucchini right now, it's monstrous, but I'm going to let it go all season until it actually becomes similar to a winter squash, where it's like, it's hard for me to kind of push my finger into the outside of it. So those things that we eat young, you have to let them go a long time, even though you can see the seeds. If you scooped out the zucchini seeds, and I have done it, if you scoop out the zucchini seeds before you really let it go and the plant even dries and dies, you're going to just get paper thin, seeds that are not going to have any viability. So how do you get the seeds out of the fruit? So there's kind of two processes. So one is kind of dry, semi-wet, where you can kind of like scoop out the seeds, remove any non-seed parts, label it, dry it. Once again, the motto is label, 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 so you know what it is later on. So beans and peppers, those things, kind of dry. My lettuce is obviously a dry one as well. And then some things are more like wet process. For example, tomatoes and melons. And if you think about the tomatoes, they've got that gel coat on. So you scoop it out, you let it ferment for a little bit of time, like 3 days, and then rinse it off and then let it dry. And that will remove the gel coat of the tomatoes. And we'll talk more about that when we get into that. So this is where it gets complicated or not, depending on which journey you want to go on. So you need to, as I mentioned, and once again, this it's going to be recorded. You are going to get all the slides from this for people that are coming in a little bit later, and we will send out a resource sheet that goes with this. Now, if you want to just have seeds and you're saving seeds for enjoyment, saving money, climate adaptation, resilience, creativity, preserving cultural, so all of these things, like you have to have a sense of like, why are you doing it? If I'm preserving something that's culturally important, I want to maintain that variety. So I want to know how to do that. If I'm looking for something like climate adaptation, I'm probably a lot more interested in something that's more genetically diverse, so that maybe something gets, responds poorly or to a pest, or something does well. So there's different reasons. If you're just wanting to save money, maybe having the varietal purity kind of coming out true to type, so it looks like the parent plant, isn't as important to you. So you're going to kind of come up with your own reason, and it might be very specific to the plant. There are some things I'm much more interested in, just like, let's have a lot of genetic diversity, and then other things that are, oh, I really love this tomato. I love the way it tastes. It really dehydrates well, and I'm interested in keeping that as it is. So you're going to kind of think about your own journey, but the main thing here is know how a little bit of basics on how to do it. And then the other thing is label, label, label. So if I go on a journey and I let a lot of things mix, when I share it with someone else, I'm not saying this is a butternut squash. I'm saying this is kind of like butternut squash-esque. And so that people know that, and they can kind of join me on that journey. So it's really about labeling and being clear about your own journey, and then also communicating that with other people. So why do you want to save seeds? So we're going to kind of go through that. Like, here you're going to choose your own adventure piece. If you're trying to preserve heirlooms, okay, then obviously purity matters, or having that things that come out true to type, like the parent plant, that matters. So you're going to want to follow the best practices, which we'll go over to maintain that varietal purity. You'll need to know and talk about need to isolate it from other things of that similar species, from that same species, or you might have to hand pollinate, for example, with the squashes and melons, to prevent cross-pollination. If your why you're doing seed saving is around climate crisis and food security, it's really about feeding yourself. So you could be more adventurous. I had a friend of mine, Lila, and she was always just planting just completely diverse whatever kind of came out of those compost pile type of squashes. And I was just like, really? I was just like, I'm here hand pollinating out in the afternoon and going in the morning and doing all that. And she's just like, it's delicious. It's fun. And I'm always surprised. So I think that, we often think that people want, a particular variety, and some people do, but there's also a lot of people that are just like, I'm just growing food for the fun of it, or I'm just enjoying mixing things up. So once again, as long as you're clear about what you're communicating, I think that that's the place that we really all want to be. So once again, if you're talking about climate crisis and food security, allowing things to cross-pollinate is not as big of a deal. We are in a semi-urban area. It is nearly impossible to save brassicas like broccoli without, the concern of it crossing with something else. So we save broccoli, we save kale, we save collards, but we just mark it all as crossed because we don't really know. And we try to offer 100% locally grown seed. And so we just, in order for us to do that, we just label things crossed. And then once again, communicate with people what your journey is. And then once again, you might have, if you are intentionally crossing things, you might want to say what is crossing, that at least that the parentage. So for example, I had a Windsor and crossed it with a Negretta fava bean, and I just labeled it Windsor cross Negretta. And then if you're just trying to, save seeds because it's fun and it saves you money, once again, you might even want to breed varieties for the future. So you might want to go down that pathway and say, what can I do to actually create a stable variety that I can gift to someone else? So seed quality pros and cons. So it's good also to know in this journey of seed saving, like what are some benefits of each of these kind of adventures that someone could go on. So first off, there's the pure, comes out true to type. So being uniform, that it all comes out at a certain, it all matures at a certain time. There's some benefits to that if you're a market gardener and you need to get everything to the market. Once again, if you're a home gardener, maybe that isn't as ideal, because what happens if there's a really hot day and the things that had already germinated all kind of die in your garden? So nature is not uniform. And so maybe that, and also like, what is purity? I think there's just kind of some words around that just kind of make me kind of question that. That's a very new concept. Because if you go to any village, 100 years ago, that uniformity was not really as, part of the seed saving culture. So obviously it comes out like you expected. If you really like something, then it coming out as a little cherry tomato that's red, that's great for dehydrating, that's awesome, because that's what you wanted. However, also that uniformity creates more susceptibility to shock because everything's kind of the same. And it's the reason I think the genetically modified crops are really they could put us at great risk because they have all that uniformity of the genetics. So also there's could be like a garden variety where you're doing your best to kind of maintain some isolation distance, but it might not be fully met. So isolation distance is when you have a certain distance between two different varieties of the same species. So for example, if I had wanted to grow the Negretta fava bean and the Windsor fava bean and have both of those, it's supposed to be 100 feet. Well, I don't have 100 feet in my house, but I can plant some in the front of my house and I can plant some in the back of my house. So I've got a little bit of a space distance, maybe with some interesting plants, flowers in between. And then the other thing is I could also plant them at different times so that they're not flowering at the same time. But I'm doing the best that I can. And so there might be a little bit of off typing with the garden variety, but it's easier to do in the home garden. And then naturalize is that's a lot of people, how they do their seed saving is things that just kind of do their own thing in their garden. The parsley that comes up or the arugula that comes up year after year. So there might be some more off typing, so it's not exactly true to type, but you don't need to plant it. It's often more resilient because it comes up on its own wherever it, does it. Now, and then with crossed or hybrids, these are unstable. So if you try to save seeds from a crossed or hybrid, they're not going to come out like what you planted. The taste could be better. The taste could be not as desirable. It could be more resilient. So some things, if you have a large if you're intentionally, and Julia will talk more about this when she talks, but there will be, if you're intentionally mixing stuff up, there's probably going to be a lot more resilience. If you have like a commercial hybrid, for example, the corns that are commercially hybrid, the first year they have a lot of vigor, but then the next generation, they don't. So that resilience could be more or less depending on what you're working with. So let's kind of talk about the choose your own adventure. So we're going to talk about 3 different adventures, and then we'll kind of dive into, we're going to dive into the, so one adventure is preserve your heirlooms of the past. And the book that is kind of, if you have a seed library or really want to get into seed saving and you're interested in preserving, traditional heritage crops, this is the book to get. So this is put out by Seed Savers Exchange. It was written, the crop content was written by Jared Zystro, who is one of the main scientists on organic seed alliance. Fabulous, fabulous book. It's gorgeous. It kind of tells you everything about, how long the seeds are viable for, isolation distances, the population size. So when you're planting something, you need to know how many plants you need to get in order to get seed that would germinate, as well as if you want to maintain the variety, how many seeds. And then it also talks about cleaning the seed. So there's different screens that you can get to clean, and it tells you which screens are best for this. So this is a great book for the preserved heirlooms of the past. We're not going to talk about this as much because it's its own topic in itself. But if you were interested in, I want to give something to the future and breed an heirloom of the future, this is the book. So this is Carol Deppy. She has a PhD from Harvard in plant biology and one of kind of the premier breeders in the United States, and also started the open source seed initiative, which is encouraging plant breeders to not patent their seeds so that anybody who wants to use what they're using, what they created as a starting point for their own breeding projects, they're able to do that. So their open source seed initiative, breed your own vegetables. So that's another way to go, creating stable varieties. And then the third way is the landrace gardening. And Julia, do you want to talk a little bit, because this is the work that you do? Do you want to talk a little bit about the landrace gardening?
I will in a couple slides.
You will in a couple slides. Okay, but it's, I mean, it's one of those things where I, as someone who has been like, this has been the book, I've been like, okay, I'm like going out and hand pollinating and population sizes and trying to figure out how do you do that in community. And because sometimes these population sizes are like, really, I don't have that much space to do that, but I want to offer good seed. When I came across the work of Joseph Lofthouse and the work that Julia is doing with Going to Seed, which is landrace gardening, which is pretty much what often happened in communities before we kind of narrowed the gene pool up, which is there's a lot more genetically diverse seed. So she'll talk about that and why, in many regards, that might be something you might want to consider doing in your own garden, as well as accepting those in your seed library. Now, when I went and I did a seed school with Bill McDormand. So he's my seed teacher. And you'll often hear a lot of words tossed around. So heirloom is the most common word when you're talking about these kind of heritage varieties that have been around for a while. But kind of one of the words that is used more in the industry is open pollinated. So open pollinated just means the plant's going to come out true to type when properly saved, which means it's going to look like the parent plant. Heirloom, on the other hand, which is more of, I think, a marketing term, is an open pollinated plant that has a face, a place, and a story. The issue is that a lot of the heirlooms that people buy, it's more like you're going to a pawn shop and buying someone else's heirloom. Like that piece of jewelry that I bought isn't part of my history. And so it's important, it's delicious, we want to preserve it, but kind of that heirloom is really something that has a face and a place and a story. So for example, Bill was interested in he owned at that time, when I met him, he owned a high altitude seed house. And he was looking to get the world's best tomato that worked at a high altitude. So he was traveling all over to try to see if he could find a tomato that would work in high altitude. So he went to Guatemala, and he's up in the mountains in Guatemala, and he gets seed from a guy, and the guy gives him a pack of American tomatoes, and he's just like, oh my gosh, this is like the home of the tomatoes and the American seed industry is up in the mountains of Guatemala. And then later on, he got invited to go to Siberia when the Soviet Union collapsed, and was going around trying to find the world's best tomato. And this guy comes up to him and he's just like, I have the world's best tomato. Do you want it? And he's like, of course, of course. And then the guy walks away and he's just like, what is going on? And the interpreter is like, finds out, it's like, oh, that's Sasha. And Sasha lives 35 to 40 kilometers in the mountains. And if he's gonna get the seeds before we leave tomorrow afternoon, he needs to start walking now to get them. And a couple years later, Martha Stewart was in a restaurant in New York and had some dish and was like, oh my goodness, I need to know the history of this tomato. It's so delicious. And traced it back that this was Sasha's Altai tomato, and wrote a whole article, like a whole edition of the Martha Stewart magazine was dedicated to heirloom tomatoes. And that's really inspired people to start saving heirloom tomatoes. And so for me, when I grow Sasha's Altai, it's kind of an heirloom because I got it from my seed teacher, and it has a story and all that stuff, and I'm excited. Now, if you look at it from Joseph Lofthouse's perspective, an heirloom is something that has been inbred for 50 years. So that kind of puts, heirloom plants in a very different perspective. And for him, he lives also in a high altitude area, very dry, kind of harsh conditions. And when he gets heirloom plants from catalogs, almost nothing works for him in his very kind of extreme climate. So, okay, now I'm going to pass it on to Julia. So Julia, do you want to share your screen at this point?
Yes.
Yeah, I will stop sharing my screen.
Okay, can you guys all see this? So as Rebecca mentioned, I went on this wild ride of adapting and to both a challenging environment and a changing environment in my coastal Mendocino County, Northern California town. And I started a local project, so seed library based on this concept of landrace gardening with high diversity, really focused on community. The mission statement of Going to Seed here is shifting agriculture towards adaptation, community, and diversity. And the nonprofit Going to Seed evolved over the last few years and out of sort of that work that Joseph Lofthouse started and has since then grown. So in 2023, we started a local collaborative project in my community, and we focused on these 3 crops that are typically warm weather summer crops, adapting them to our cool summer climate. So winter squash and melons and sweet corn. And that project was really instructive because we had a lot of enthusiasm, right? People would stop me in the grocery store like, Julia, this is so important. And I was all excited for like abundant seed returns based on enthusiasm, but it didn't work out that way, right? We got few seed returns. And so I decided that based on the enthusiasm and the sort of high failure rate, we needed to do more and support people more in this process of increasing local seed returns. So this project since then has evolved into it's called Nourishing Seeds, and it's a collaboration between Hakakadile, which is an indigenous local women-led nonprofit, and Going to Seed to really sort of find the secret sauce for community level seed projects and what causes people to really succeed in that sort of wild adventure that Rebecca mentioned. So we do a lot of seed saving workshops, and we also worked in the East Bay, not just Mendocino County, and in different seed libraries in Mendocino County. So we've learned a lot, and I feel like I'm ready to sort of share some of the preliminary results we've had for anyone who's wondering about the same things that I have been wondering, like how to support more seed savers, how to really succeed and sort of shift the culture towards this community seed saving, adaptation, seed returns, growing for seed together. And so this community of volunteers evolved, and here we are working in this garage with a giant monster overseeing us. And we started accepting seeds from community members, from our from our own gardens. I had already been growing for a few years, as you could see in that, those 3 crops that we'd been adapting to the local climate. So for example, some of these seed packets look like this. So kale, a diverse mix of kale, some perennial, contributed by gardeners from around Mendocino County. And this is another one, melons, a wide mix of heirlooms selected for early ripening. So it's kind of unheard of to grow melons in my climate. And we have gotten pretty reliable melon harvest now. So Rebecca mentioned label, label, label. We try to be really clear. The descriptions and the photos, these are diverse mixes. And while we value the work of heirloom seed savers, this particular project is a little bit different. And we've been able to, we have something like 45 different species now in our seed library. So this mindset shift has been important in my work with Going to Seed, and with this particular project, I spent time in Mexico with Oaxacan seed savers and in the US with indigenous seed savers. And I really wanted to focus on this mindset shift. In the US, and I know I've had this mindset that I grew up with in regenerative agriculture, which was the focus on the soil. Soil is important, but typically we lack the focus on the seeds and the crops over time. So when you focus on soil and you buy all your seeds, you also have to then change the environment to ensure survival. So Rebecca mentioned the heirlooms, there's someone else's story. Well, when we bring in someone else's story, then we typically have to bring in the climate that those heirlooms need. So that might be greenhouses, remake covers, more fertilizer. And that's the mindset that I wanted to shift away from. That's why I love the book Landrace Gardening, because it solved these problems of this intensive resource use in agriculture and our food system. So moving towards this ancestral or indigenous mindset where you have more of a relationship with your seeds over time, right? So you're prioritizing genetic adaptation. And that's through environmental selection, natural selection, and also human selection. So it's really important mindset shift that I try to teach, and takes a while, but once you kind of can adopt it, it becomes so much more relaxing. You're not always having to do things, right? You don't have to buy things. You're just more of like in the flow of, is this meant to be in my garden or is it not? It's okay. And so here's an example of that mindset shift where we have a diverse mix, right? These are all dry beans, they're all delicious, but they grow very differently in the same soil and the same challenges. So some are getting eaten by bugs and some are not getting the nutrients they need, and some are fine, they're totally fine. So this is like, okay, I planted a lot of seeds so that now I can be like, okay, 2 of these, to celebrate them, they are doing great, and I'm going to save the seeds of those. And the other ones, I'll either thin or I just won't worry about it. So this is the power of genetic diversity, in that over time, when you're a seed saver, you can really adapt a population to be healthy. And so that when the other gardeners in my seed project that don't have that much space or experience, they will take my beans, and they've already been through several seasons of the sandy soil and the cold summer, and those are more likely to thrive. And then here's a zucchini example. So we have, I don't know if you can see this one on the right, we have they're both zucchinis, and they're all planted on the same day, same everything. And one of them is just totally healthy. The bugs don't want to eat it. It's able to produce those natural antioxidants and chemicals that are protecting it. And the ones on the right, there's one in the middle that has no circle here. They're just getting hammered, and they're just not meant to be here. And that's also the power of diverse ancestry, right? These are populations that, the one on the left has diverse ancestry where it has more of the tools. It hasn't been isolated over many generations. And so it has more of that kind of hybrid vigor that you see with hybrids, but not in the commercial hybrid sense, right? It's natural, just diverse ancestry that nature really benefits from. So this is what this is what that wild ride looks like, right? So we have beans, dry beans up in the top right that are all delicious and you can eat them together and they just are beautiful to me. And I hope, I after all this time when I see beans that are everything is all the same, I'm like, where are my colors? Where's those differences when I'm cooking them? And then runner beans and winter squash here has all been selected over many years to be delicious, but they're not true to type, right? They're just, the priority is on what tastes good, what grows well in my climate, doesn't get eaten by the squash bugs or the lack of soil fertility, and then this beautiful corn. So diverse ancestry in action here. And there are benefits to gardeners and to seed libraries that I'll talk about, and to gardeners to start with. So when we give out seed packets, people are excited in this climate because they know that those have produced tomatoes or beans or whatever it is in this cold summer climate. So they're enthusiastic about that. And then for seed savers, fewer rules to learn and ways for them to mess up. So over the last few years, I've talked to a lot of people about why they save seeds and why they don't. And a lot of people have this high anxiety, right? They're going to mess up and they can't contribute to their local seed library. This is an example of a really important contributor in my community. She has tons of seeds and she's so generous. And the local seed library wasn't able to accept her seeds because of diverse, parentage. And so it can be more inclusive for more gardeners. And then the focus becomes more on community and flavor, individual preferences, not on variety and purity. So the other thing, Rebecca mentioned this minimum population size requirements to keep a variety from becoming inbred. So this is another reason that often gardeners feel like they can't be seed savers, they don't have enough space. Because for the butternut squash, for example, right, you are supposed to plant, if you have a variety that you want to maintain genetic health into the future, you need to have at least 25 plants of the same variety. Well, a lot of gardeners just don't want to grow like that, of course. And when you have more of a diverse population here, it's not just butternut, but moschata species. They're all selected to, again, to taste good. You can have 2 plants and you're going to avoid inbreeding depression. So, I mean, the more the better, but 2 plants is okay. So you can have people that weren't able to save seeds before that now they can. And what about benefits to seed librarians? And now after a couple years, I can speak to this also. And you can have more contributed seeds. So instead of saying, well, these Maxima squash, for example, I don't know which varieties they are, as long as the requirements are like, well, did they taste good and did they do well in your garden, then the diverse parentage is less of an issue. We'll talk more a little bit later about when it really matters, but in some cases, in a lot of cases, it's okay to have more of diversity and you can receive more seeds. And then this, we have, in the cases where having those heirloom tomatoes is important, this is not an either or situation, right? You can have both. So instead of having, 15 different tomato varieties from contributed seeds or purchased seeds or whatever it is, you can have the ones that are really popular and important to your community, and then a mix. So you can have a mix of, slicing tomatoes that grow in your area. That's 25 different varieties. And this is something unusual, right? No, you can't get this from seed companies or from commercial sources. So this has been the case in my community and the places that I've gone, is people get excited about local seeds because it's something different that they can't get anywhere else. And here are a couple more examples of our labeling. So carrots and tomatoes, hot peppers. We just want to be really clear that these are mixes, and that so far has been really clear. No one's been confused. So let's take an example for seed library. You get a loving, homegrown seed contribution of unknown heritage, and say it's one of these things. So what do you do now if you're embracing this concept of increasing diversity and going on this wild ride? So you can just add it to one of your mixes, right? And this is an example of ours before we had some better labels. But so like colorful lettuce mix, how much easier is that than all the 15 different varieties of lettuce that you would need to keep track of? And often it can be by species. So cucumber species, melons. This is really freeing when you can start doing this. And a lot of times we did, we had cut up, like, when do we need to do germ testing for contributed seeds? So we did a lot of germ testing this year, and we'll keep doing that. And that was really important. But sometimes if you get a small contribution, we didn't germ test that. We'll germ test the bigger mix so that we can tell people, is this 75% or 80%? But when we got a big contribution of potentially old seeds, we would always germ test it before adding it to our mix. And also sometimes you just get all kinds of seeds and you just want to make a pollinator mix. And tell me in the chat if this is something that you guys already do. And then this brassica, where everything can be mixed. Well, we got contributions that were, broccoli, cauliflower, all in the same bag. So we decided to make this brassica baby braising mix. And summer squash. Summer squash is really the most challenging, I think, species. So we'll talk a little bit more about the pepo species and squash and what to keep separate in your summer squash. But this is an example of, it's okay. Your crookneck squash might have crossed with your zucchini. That's okay. And we do some education around when it's not okay. So it's crossing spaghetti squash with zucchini in our case is not okay. But also we want to encourage people, like, that may happen, but if you grow seeds from ours, you may get that cross that isn't perfect. And we're prioritizing community and diversity and planting extra, and then learning how to thin some of those out. So the big question that you guys are probably wondering about, and I certainly wondered about when embarking on this whole endeavor, was, what if nobody wants these seed mixes? And so I can speak more confidently to that now, because after the last year, it's been a couple of years since I've worked with Going to Seed, and a year locally distributing seed, is people want these mixes. So over the winter and spring, I was all over California. I was in Humboldt County, Mendocino County. We had a dozen seed exchanges, Sonoma County, and then East Bay, Eco Farm, the Heirlooms Festival, Bakersfield. So I focused on really interacting with people over the last year and putting diverse seed packets in front of them. And I was happy to find that it was objections to crossing heirlooms were much more rare than I expected, as long as, everything is clear. And we value those heirloom seed savers, but this is a different kind of the wild ride project. So we had one objection, but really that was among thousands. So we distributed at least 7,000 seed packets through our local project. And then Going to Seed has a separate project where gardeners are contributing from all over the country, and that was over 5,000 packets. And then locally, we signed up a bunch of people, more than I expected, to grow a single crop to share seeds with the community, so that, they could just focus on one thing and not have to feel like they need to change everything they're doing. So I want to give you guys some confidence that as long as the framing is, this is a focus on community, diversity, adaptation, and deliciousness, that people want these local seeds. And this is a project that is evolving, and this is our second year in it. People We're not giving our seeds out to people unless they commit to growing one thing more than they need for themselves and sharing it with their community. So this guy is growing potatoes from true seed, and someone else is, signing up for what she's going to grow. And that's an ongoing project that we'd love to expand with other seed libraries. We're sort of creating this model that Going to Seed is creating a template for. So I'd love to hear from more of you guys if anyone wants to work on this with us. Okay, so mixes to avoid. There is some educational component here. We don't want everything to cross. So for example, think of it like how you eat things. So you don't want your flour corn crossed with your sweet corn, but among the flour corn varieties, in this case, we encourage that diversity. And then squash species, I've taught a lot of people how to tell apart their squash species. And that has been really empowering for people, because a lot of people surprisingly don't know what crosses with what in the cucurbit family. So there's also the bitter gene that people have heard of. They shouldn't save seeds because their squash seeds will be bitter, right? That comes from the decorative peppos. So if we have time at the end, we can talk more about squash species, or we can do another class on that. But if you're growing zucchinis or delicatas or anything like that in the peppo species, just avoid any of those decorative peppos, because they have that bitter gene, and you don't want that anywhere near your squash. But if you taste bitterness, it's a really obvious and instant feedback where it won't taste good. So don't keep eating it and don't save the seeds. And then so hot peppers and sweet peppers, they're in the same species and we don't want them to cross. And then anything that doesn't taste good, right? We don't want those. And then some people have a lot of this Queen Anne's lace around their gardens. And so in that case, you don't want to save carrot seed. So don't try to do everything. Pick a couple of things, learn more about that, and then sort of change your mindset towards community and adaptation and diversity, and don't worry about the purity component. So I want to mention this again because I feel like it's important, is this heirlooms and diversity, and it's not either or, right? You can do both. You can have certain things that you take care of, and that it's worth it to put, the greenhouse, the extra fertilizer, whatever it takes to keep that really special heirloom with that story that you feel attached to. But you can also, choose another species, or choose something where you want to learn more about it, you want to taste it more, you want to explore the deep history, right? The seed history that goes back 10,000 years, and go back to that indigenous and ancestral mindset of domestication and adaptation, and taking some control in how this evolves in your local community, and then sharing it potentially with other communities. So that's it for my portion of the presentation. And if you guys have questions, I'm happy to answer questions at the end. And I'm also happy to talk with more seed librarians. Anyone who wants to start their own project, I'd love to be involved in more projects.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Julia. I mean, Richmond Grows and was one of the projects that we worked with Going to Seed, and it was just such a delight we have like 40 people our first time that came together, and we're committed to growing out these diverse mixes and really excited about it. So we're now in our second year of this project with Going to Seed. So yay. Okay, so when does purity matter, to kind of pick it up there? So we're going to talk about, once again, it's this choose your own adventure, whether it's, you wanting to really maintain a variety. Like I said, this one here, which is breed your own vegetables, we're not going to talk about that, but you at least know it's something where you can create a stable one. And then obviously what Julia's been talking about, mixing things up, kind of really celebrating the diversity, welcoming into your community, welcoming into your seed library, well, regardless of which direction you go, label, label, label. So when does having that varietal purity matter? obviously, if we were selling seeds, which we're not in a seed library, having that coming out true to type would be important. If you were trading seeds with someone, then obviously, as a minimum, you want to explain whether or not you let things cross, or you know that they're crossed or they're mixed. If you are trying to preserve something that has a particular story or cultural significance or taste or characteristic, then obviously you would want to preserve it. So for example, on my block, one of my neighbors, Danny, he has been growing great Aunt Rosie's Italian pole beans. He's been on the block for 35 years. It's been part of his wife's family for generations, because great Aunt Rosie was her great Aunt Rosie. And so, like, for me, like, that's something that I'm committed to preserving. So I'm not mixing that one up because I care about it. It's got a great story. It is really interesting because it's like, it's my mom's favorite green bean. It's my neighbor's favorite green bean. It's my mom's favorite shelling bean. And it's like, and it's a great soup bean. And it's just like all around a great bean. So I'm like super committed to preserving that one. So, but just know what your reason is for that particular plant, or just in general, if you have a particular direction you want to go with your seed saving. So as I go through the rest of the presentation, when we're going into more specifics, anything in blue is going to be really, how do you do this journey? Okay. So cross-pollination is when pollen is coming from one flower to a different flower. If it's obviously on the same plant, it's going to come out same mom, same dad, in terms of the variety, it's going to come out like the parent. If it comes from one plant that's the same variety and to another plant that's the same variety, it's going to come out, the seeds are going to be similar to the parents. But if it comes from two different type of varieties, that's when, if the pollen comes from, which is the male part, comes from one variety of tomato and goes to well, I should probably use a squash because those are more likely to cross-pollinate. If an insect comes from one zucchini variety and goes to another zucchini plant of a different variety, then while your Costata romanesco is going to look exactly like a Costata romanesco, when you go to save those seeds and plant them the next year, it's going to be some mix of those two different parentages. So if you are wanting to maintain that Costata romanesco, which is like my favorite type of zucchini, then you would want to avoid cross-pollination. Once again, anything in blue is going to be what you want to look for. Once again, if you're looking to create an intentional mix, then you might welcome that. So I have added Costata romanesco into the mix that Julia provided, that mostly zucchini one, along with, because they've got a really interesting mix. And then I added my favorite into it. And some years I will specifically save the Costata romanesco because I really like it. And it's really interesting because you can actually dry that zucchini and it comes out really nice as like something you can add into soups for wintertime. So that's a really nice characteristic that a lot of zucchini doesn't have. So some years I save it, hand pollinate it. Some years I let it cross. I'm going to let it go into the mix. But as long as I kind of know and I communicate it, label. Oopsie daisy. So it's helpful to know a little bit about the kind of the scientific name. So for example, the family name, if you're talking about tomatoes, the family name is the nightshades. The species is tomato, or the common name is tomato. And there's lots of different varieties of tomatoes: Brandywine, Sun Gold, Roma. And those, while tomatoes will tend to be very extremely self-pollinated, they could cross-pollinate and mix up the pollen from one and to another one. So, okay. And that was your slide. Did you want to add anything about that one?
Yeah, I mean, tomatoes might not be the best example, but the main thing that we want to understand is the species. So species cross-pollinate within each other.
Yes. Okay. Thank you. And then also it's very interesting because Sun Gold is a hybrid. And there's actually a breeder who has come up with one called California Sun Gold. So many people have tried to stabilize Sun Gold and get Sun Gold, but it's a hybrid and nobody seems to be able to stabilize it. But there is a modern plant breeder, these two guys that are working on it, and they have a thing called California Sun Gold, which I have on my counter right now saving, and it's reasonably similar. So it's a stable hybrid that's similar in tasting to the Sun Gold, which is a hybrid. So to maintain varietal purity, there are some things that we label in the seed library as super easy. So if you have a seed library, you might have your collection with super easy, easy and difficult kind of labels. So things that are super easy, they are extremely self-pollinating. So if you imagine like a flower, and inside of the flower, there's the male part and the female parts. And ones that are extremely self-pollinating, the male part, the pollen, gets into the female part before the flower is even open and insects can get in there. So they're, in that case, it's already kind of pollinated itself, fertilized itself, and kind of the offspring tend to be like the parents. So these are the super easy ones. So peas, beans, tomatoes, lettuce, wheat, and arugula. These are extremely self-pollinated. So if you really wanted to maintain varietal purity, or you wanted to get people comfortable starting with seed saving, and they really wanted to kind of, stick in this narrow thing of kind of keeping the parentage the same, these would be the species you would encourage people to start with. So other things are going to more easily cross-pollinate and hybridize, so like a mix of two different parents. And if it was important for you to have the plant coming out like the parent, then some ways you can go about that is you can isolate by distance. So as I was mentioning a little bit earlier, if I wanted to have those two fava beans, the Negretta and the Windsor, I could have the Windsor in the front and the Negretta in the back. So I've got some distance and a house. So I've got a barrier between the two. So that makes it a little bit harder for the insects that can get into the fava beans, getting between those two different kind of populations. So another way you could go about it is you can also put barriers around stuff. So you can see here, this is a pepper plant. Or no, that's a tomato plant, sorry. A tomato plant that has a little mesh bag on it. And once again, tomato plants tend to be extremely self-pollinating. Peppers do have a little bit of insect activity. It really depends on where you live. So there's no strict way on that, but you could put over an eggplant or a pepper flower, a little mesh bag, and then it would be self-pollinated if the fruit actually developed. The other thing you'd want to know is after you do that, you want to put a little ribbon or something on it so you know it's that pepper or it's that eggplant that got self-pollinated. And then one of kind of the main things to know is that when you're saving seeds, to always save from the healthiest plants, to try to save from as many plants as you can to increase the genetic diversity. And once again, that might be limited by your size, but when we're doing it in community, so if a population size, is something like 20, and you can only grow 10, but if someone else in the community is also growing 10, then kind of you can sometimes pull those two seed populations together, and then you've got that 20 to kind of maintain that varietal or genetic expression, depending on which size you're looking at. So what type of seeds should I plant and save? So never save seeds from PVP. So PVP stands for plant variety protection. And so while you're able to save anything for home consumption, you cannot save it and put it in a seed library. That would be illegal. So do not save from PVP plants. Obviously, also saving genetically modified seeds is also illegal. Fortunately, they're not too much in the home garden, although there was an issue with Baker Creek and some purple tomato that was genetically modified. But so far, it has not crept into the home garden scene too much. The other thing you really want to avoid is saving commercial hybrids, and not for the reason you think it is. So if you saved commercial hybrid seeds, you would get, some interesting mix the following year. There are some that actually have male sterility, and Julia will talk about this at the end. So if you were saving commercial hybrids, and you, like, let's say, for example, with my carrot population, and I'll talk about carrots, I grow a lot of carrots. The population size is 50, and all of them are sacrificial, which means I can't eat a single one because by the time it's gone to flower, it's going to be super woody and not edible. And it's like, I'm there's, so I have a school garden, and so I can put 50 carrots out and do that, but I can also do a smaller population that's more genetically mixed. So I planted carrots, but I planted 6 different varieties, but not 50. All of them went to seed, but I would not have wanted to start with a commercial hybrid carrot because they actually have male sterility, and then I could introduce sterility into that seed mix. So really avoid saving the commercial hybrids because you can introduce sterility into your mix. And then with corn, while you're not going to get the sterility, they really only have vigor for 1 year, and that next year, whatever you save is not going to be as robust. So saving commercial hybrids is, you're going to want to really discourage people from doing it. And the commercial hybrids could say hybrid on the packet, but some other terms you might also see are things like F1, which means filial one, or the first offspring, or just F. So all of those are kind of things you would want to avoid. And once again, if you're interested in having the variety matters, you're not going to be saving from hybrids anyways. You're going to be saving from the things that are labeled open pollinated or heirloom seeds. So types of seeds I should plant. So open pollinated usually means a variety, not diverse ancestry. So it's kind of, all showing up the same kind of appearance. A Grex is something that's naturally promiscuous, pollinated, so it's got a little bit of a cross. And then the land races have a lot more genetically diverse, and sometimes there's historic land races. For example, I have a Hungarian land race parsley. So if you went to some area in Hungary, this was the parsley that they grew. So it's not all as uniform, but it definitely is parsley, tastes similar, but the growth habits just a little bit different. And Julia, did you want to add anything about Grexes and land races? Because that's kind of your area of expertise.
No, I think you got it.
Okay. And I also sometimes think, and you could correct me on this, I always think about Grexes as being maybe also a little bit like, I've known some people that have done like smaller, like Grexes, where it's just a less of a sampling, where I think about land races also being like a lot more in the mix, where sometimes the Grexes being, like a few things mixed together. Okay. Thank you. Okay. We're all learning this together here. So how do I get started? So one thing to think about is keeping records, and like, how are you going to know what you planted? One thing is to keep track of the seed source, the year of the seed, the variety. So sometimes when you plant something, it doesn't germinate or doesn't do well. And is that because the seed is older? Sometimes I have gotten seed and it has just not been very good. And it's like, oh, I've just noticed, when I bought seeds from or gotten seeds from X company, I haven't had as much success. So that's also something to note, is that some seed houses are a little bit, have higher quality seed, rely just continually, and others sometimes get some weird stuff. No one shall be named. And then start with good seed. So if you're wanting to save seeds, having open pollinator heirloom seeds or a good mix to start with is good. Thinking about planning your garden for population size, like how many plants am I going to need? Am I going to have more than one of this particular species? Do I need to have an isolation distance? I could do it from, like I said, front, one type of fava, back another type, or I could do it by time. I could plant fall favas and spring favas. So kind of thinking about how are you going to do that? So those isolation distances or time distances are going to be really important for things that cross-pollinate if you're trying to maintain that varietal purity. And then also knowing what your neighbors plant. So if I'm growing a whole bunch of zucchini and my neighbor, which is the pepo or peppo, or however you want to pronounce it, if I'm growing a whole bunch of the peppos and someone's growing acorn squash by me, those insects could come over and cross-pollinate, and I could get some weird crosses in my mix. And then also it's really good to talk with your neighbors about what they're growing, because for years, and Julia and I both live in coastal California, which is kind of foggy and not great because we have a 365 growing season, but some things just don't do really well. Like getting large beefsteak type of tomatoes doesn't really do well. And it was years I was trying to plant Brandywine, which was one of my favorite tomatoes. And finally I talked with one of my neighbors who was a gardener. They're like, you can't grow Brandywines here. They just don't grow in this climate. So sometimes that also is a good source of important information to know. What is family planning in the seed world? So it's really helpful to know about plant families. So at Richmond Grows, we have everything organized by plant family because those plant families also kind of help you understand a little bit about seed saving requirements. For example, in this case, these are all part of the Apiaceae family, and they are all insect pollinated. So dill, carrots, and fennel, you can see the flower structure is similar. Same thing, peas and beans are in the same family, and they also are super easy to save seeds from. Fava beans and runner beans being a little bit more insect pollinated, but they're dry on the plant, and that's the seed saving. So if you know the family, it helps you a little bit kind of group stuff together. So when is it likely to come out? Like the parents, if you're trying to maintain that varietal purity, once again, you could label things in your seed library: beans, peas, lettuce, tomatoes, wheat. These are going to come out true to type, extremely self-pollinating, good to go if you're trying to maintain that varietal purity and like you're a total beginner and you're concerned about it. So we're going to talk a little bit about individual plant species to kind of give some more context about how to do this. So pea and bean family. As I mentioned, these are the super easy ones, extremely self-pollinating. You could even plant two reasonably close together and they're probably going to be fine. And this book here will talk a lot about how many plants you need in order to get seed that you could plant the following year. So if you planted one runner bean or one temporary bean or one pea plant, you would get seed that you could plant for next year. Obviously, the more the merrier, and having more is going to get you more genetic diversity. Maybe one of those plants is a little bit more resilient in a heat wave. Maybe another plant is a little bit more resistant to powdery mildew for the peas. So having more is going to be better, but if you could only plant one, you would get viable seed. And once again, if you're trying to do, and they're extreme low chance of cross-pollination, except for the favas and runner beans. So once again, those you would want to isolate by some distance or time, or only plant one variety. So that's another strategy. So what are your strategies to reduce cross-pollination if you're interested in that varietal purity? Plant one variety. This year, I'm going to plant the Negrettas. Next year, I'm going to plant the Windsor fava beans, or plant the Negrettas in the front, plant the Windsor in the back. So there's different strategies. Plant one in the fall, plant one in the spring. So planting so they're not flowering at the same time. So the isolation distance for peas is 50 feet. Not everybody has that space. So once again, do you kind of not have 50 and you maybe only have like 20 feet? And once again, that's more going to be with the pea and bean family. Once again, there's very little chance of them cross-pollinating, but if it's something really important, you might not want to take any risk at all. So you have to kind of weigh out what is important to you and the risks that you're willing to take, and then kind of communicate that when you share that out with other people. And then when are those seeds ready? So this is just kind of a fava bean that I found in our school garden. So it's like, it dried on the plant. And so if it dries on the plant, it is going to be, and it's crunchy, that is the time you want it. And then they'll kind of shatter, with a hammer if you hit it. But you can tell it's dry and crunchy and it dried on the plant. That is good to go. Now, when we're saving seeds, so this morning I was doing a show and tell around envelopes and labeling. And one of the things to really think about is that in the seed libraries, we don't always have the commercial packet that's got everything and all the information. So we want to be communicating that with people. For example, for the peas, you want to say, is this a sugar snap pea? Is this a snow pea? Is it a shelling pea? What is its use, so that when people are buying it, like I would be bummed if I want a sugar snap pea and I got shelling peas. Adding that little piece of information is going to be really helpful on your labels when you do it. And then I also even put the little super easy icon on so that people know, and even seed saving instructions on the label. And then other things to think about as we're thinking about, every time you're saving seeds, you are becoming a plant breeder. And what are you selecting for? Are you just being really casual and just picking, whatever was left at the end of the season? Or are you being more intentional and being like, wow, this, and recording some of that? Oh, this was really a heavy bearer. This was a long season. Or this really produced super early. And that was great because then we got an early frost and lost everything. So wanting to kind of communicate that with people is super helpful. Taste, disease resistance, drought tolerance. So all of these are things you might want to add to your labels when you share it with other people, and or notes to yourself, so that you kind of are keeping a record of what you're noticing in your own garden. So I've said it a couple times because it's important to know, is if purity matters, fava beans and runners, if planted close together, will cross. Ask me how I know. First of my seed journey, all of a sudden I was like, what? Why are my purple favas not purple? I was so like, but fortunately I had gifted some to people the first year and I got them back. But if that matters to you, that would be a concern. And I know Julia has some of her fava beans with her. So at the end, she can show you her genetically diverse, absolutely gorgeous mix, unless you have it right with you and you want to show us right now, like what does a genetically diverse mix of favas look like? Because it's so gorgeous that, I don't know, whenever I cook fava, they all taste the same. So I'm just like,
I'm actually separating them
oh, are you
because
separating them?
I'm
Okay.
separating them now because they do taste a lot different, and I want to be able to know the different ones in the green phase when I can't see colors.
Oh, I cannot taste the difference between my fava beans. So I'm just like, for me, I'm just like, they're just pretty. Okay, well, good to know that you have a taste that actually can distinguish between those, whereas me, I'm like, they're all taste like fava beans. Okay, so if purity is not important, you can mix them up. And there's some really cool fava beans out there, and it's super fun when you've got the browns and the greens and the purples. And then there's this one that looks like a little thumbprint on it. And have that all come out, especially if you've got kids to process that, it is really super fun. But once again, purity matters, only plant one variety. Plant them at different times. Plant them at different sides of your house. So there's some solutions there. Once again, that's for favas and runners. Choose your own adventure. Lettuce. So lettuce is extremely self-pollinated. So this one really pretty much, you can plant lots of things together and there's very little chance of cross-pollinating. If you really wanted to keep something 10 feet, which is usually a manageable distance that a home gardener can do. And they get big. I mean, so the other thing to think about is that you can get viable seeds from one plant, but the other thing to note is that lettuce can get really big. This is just a small branch from one lettuce plant. That it was much bigger than this. It was like this. And then, when you just go in there and, I don't know if you kind of the little black, this is a black seeded lettuce, there's white seeded ones as well. And then you get to, it's really fun to process, although right now, not necessarily. Right now I've got little fluffs everywhere. Same thing, you want to be communicating with people, what type of lettuce is this? This is a butterhead, is it a crisp head? The thing with crisp head is you're not really going to be able to eat that and save the seeds. So I tend to go more with the loose leaf and butterhead because I can pull those leaves off and then let it bolt and still get kind of like both the seed and the lettuce to eat. And then you can kind of see some pictures here of the lettuce. So it's going to bolt, you're going to let it bolt, and then you're going to see those white fluffy things on the top. So usually about when it's like 50% or so more fluffy on the top, cut it off, stick it in a labeled bag, So this says mix Richmond, and then I wrote the parents that were on it. So there were a bunch of different lettuces in that mix. So I put them all on there and then just stick it in a bag upside down to kind of let it dry up a little bit more, and then winnowing it and having some different size sieves is really helpful. There are also some screens, some seed saving screens that are also really nice to have, which we could probably put in our resource sheet when we send out. So if you have a seed library, having a set of screens is a really worthwhile investment if you have the space for them. And then tomatoes. So once again, super easy. Start with heirloom or open pollinated. They tend to come out fruita type. You'll get viable seeds from one, but once again, if you have more genetic diversity, that's why it's like not everybody wants to have 10 tomatoes of the same type. Hence the reason if you have multiple people growing them out, then you can pull those seeds together and then you'll have more of that diversity that you would like. And once again, 10 to 50 feet for like commercial standards for varietal purity. Once again, in the home garden, we tend not to have that space and they tend to still be true to type. So, and there's some pictures here about how to save the tomato seeds. So here's, if you looked at, if you went into my kitchen, you would see this going on right now. So basically I took my tomato, squeezed it into a jar with a little bit of, the pulp and the seeds. And then I often will add a little bit of water because I'm going to let it sit for 2 to 3 days. And then on the top, a mold is going to form. And that what that mold does is it breaks that gel coat down that's on the outside. And you can see label, label, label. So I know what it is. And then I'm going to just take off the mold after the 2 to 3 days, and then rinse it off and then put it on a plate to dry, for like a week or so out of the direct sun. And then put it in an envelope and it's ready to go for next year. So exciting. Same thing, you want to, as you're sharing these, like tell people a little bit about not just tomato, but what about this tomato? So is this a bush plant? Is this a vining plant? Is this a red tomato? Is it a pear tomato? Like what's the shape? What's the color? What's the size? What do you use it for? Are you juicing this? Are you dehydrating it? Was it disease resistant? Is it early, late? Does it have a really long season? So wanting to kind of have that information is super helpful. And then the length of the harvest. So I had one last year, the Sebastopol tomato. Oh my gosh, it was like a winner. It was my earliest tomato, went all the way through to November. In November, I got 2 large basins of tomatoes and just made a whole bunch of roasted tomatoes. So it was like fabulous. So like that, when I communicate and share that out, like letting people know that information versus it's like, oh, it's just a little, cherry tomato or like the small globe. And once again, these are going to mostly come out true to type. So in terms of the varietal purity piece, wheat is something that a lot of people don't grow. It's not as hard to process as people think. I have like a big jar of wheat that I grew. So I do it more for the wheat berries versus like getting through the whole process of like grinding. But I had it in my front yard and people would just come by and marvel. It's so pretty to see this like little patch of wheat growing in my front yard. So it's self-pollinating, can be wind pollinated. 10 to 20 feet isolation distance, but once again, often comes out true to type, even if there's more. And there's a really cool project called the Evolutionary Wheat Breeding Project, where they took a whole bunch of seeds, different types, and it was done in Syria. And Julia can probably talk at the end about it a little bit, because Joseph is talking with the guy who did this project in Syria, but it was really like, how can we in Syria create seeds that are going to work in this ever increasingly harsh climate? A lot of people don't realize that the Syrian war was really a climate war. It was like the wheat crashed and civil unrest happened because people didn't have food. And this guy was working on how do they solve that. And he was able to get some of the seed out. He's an Italian guy, but he was able to get some of the seed out of Syria. And so it is still being grown out by some people. And in here is a little video about how to process the seeds. So, because it's not as complicated as people think. So squash, melons, cucumbers, they are all in the cucurbit family. And if you are trying to maintain the same variety, so if I want the wall-time butternut squash and I want to keep that variety, I have to hand pollinate it. And it's a process. It's not just like, oh, I'm going to pollinate it. It's like you have to we're going to go through the process. So, but there are 4 different species, and at the end, Julia will probably have a little bit of time to go through the different species and how to recognize them, or at least it's part of the presentation that you'll get, so you'll see that. So you can get viable squash with 1 plant. Genetic diversity, like 5 to 10. Some books say like 25. Nobody in their right mind at least wants 25 squash for their own home use, and nor do they have space. So that's why doing it in a community, or sometimes having those genetically diverse crops, makes it a little bit more manageable in terms of being able to have that seed. So this is the general process if you are going to hand pollinate and maintain a variety. And once again, when you get the slideshow later, this video here is great. It's from the late John Navazio, who was one of the people that started Organic Seed Alliance. He passed away last month, but he was one of the main breeders for Johnny Select Seeds the last few years. And he goes through how to do hand pollination. But the basic thing is you go out in the late afternoon and you find a female. So you can see this is a female because it's got the little immature fruit. And then you'll find a little male that's just kind of like a little, like a little stick. And then you would tape off. So I'm taping off the female, taping off the female, and I'm taping off the male. And you can see that they look like they're about to open, like they're nice color and everything like that. And I go in the afternoon and I tape them shut. I tend to use painter's tape because it comes off a little bit easier than masking tape. And then you have to go out early the next morning. And if you don't go out early enough, the bees will actually like drill holes in them. That can happen. And if a bee drills a hole in it, it's over. You have to start over again another day. So you basically go out, you take the male off. So you'd cut the male off, you open the flower up, and then so this is the female, then I open the female up. So let's say this is the female flower, and I basically this is the male, this was the male with the flower, and I took all the petals off. So I just have a little stick. Here's a female flower, and then I take my male, which has now been cut off from the plant, and I just use it like a paintbrush, and I go in there and I do the top on the female part, and then I have to close it back up because I'm the one who's pollinating it. It's not an insect. And so I seal it back up, and then I have to tape it back closed. And then you can see that they put a ribbon on it because in a couple days that flower is going to fall off. And in a couple months, you're not going to know which ones you hand pollinated. So that's your indication that you know that it was that one. But keep it loose enough that it doesn't then like strangle the plant. Okay, so a couple of tips on this. So start with hand pollinated squash. Those flowers, as you can see, are a little bit larger versus something like a cucumber. The flowers are minuscule, so that would be very, very hard to like hand pollinate and deal with. Another one, and this is a tip from one of the seed savers at Richmond Grows, is she will often plant some extra seeds about 2 months out of the same variety. And the reason is if any of you have had this experience of like when your squash is blooming, it's only females or it's only males, and you're just like, I need the other one. So if you plant them, you plant your initial one, and then 2 months later you plant more, then you'll have the males and the females in order to do it is cross-pollination because it's a different plant, but it is the same variety. So you'll get something that comes out true to type. And then once again, there's the choose your own adventure with the moshatta butternut kind of mix that Julia and Joseph are dealing with in the landrace gardening piece. So Brassica oleracea. Oh my goodness. So we put this as difficult because this is why it's helpful sometimes to know the scientific name. So Brassica oleracea is the name for kale, collards, cabbage, broccoli, cauliflower, Brussels sprouts, and kohlrabi. So many, many, many centuries ago, there was a wild Brassica oleracea, and some people saved it because they liked the leaves, and some people liked, and made little, heads, and other people, whatever. So people over time saved it, and the structure, they saved it for different structures, like the flowers. And that's how we got this very different looking, but same species. So any kale can cross with any one of these other things, and any variety of kale could cross with any other variety of kale. So we do accept these in our seed library, but we just automatically mark them as crossed. So, and the other thing to note is that it says the viable seed, whereas with the peas and the other things, you just needed one plant and you would be able to get seeds. These are auto incompatible, so they don't accept their own pollen. So you need other plants in order to get the pollen. So you can't just have one kale plant and get viable seeds. You need to have other kales in order to get the seeds, and then mark it crossed. Just always, if someone's giving you one of these, crossed, because you really don't know what it's going to be. It'll be green, it'll be delicious, and it might not be what it says it is. Okay, but arugula is also brassica, a different species, and it generally comes out true to type. And this is what we have in our library at Richmond Grows. We have just a little crossed stamp. So it just makes it really obvious. We go through, if someone donates something, we don't know who the person is. Like we've had people donate squash seeds at the beginning. And in the beginning, we would just sometimes just toss those. Now we're a little bit more open to different things, but we would just label it cross. Same thing with like sunflowers. Sunflowers are insect pollinated. You know, someone donated 10 different varieties of sunflowers, or you're like, yeah, those were all crossed. Okay, some other things that are insect pollinated. So mustards, you know, once again, not accepting their own pollen because it's saying viable, you need 5. Insect pollinated, possibly self-pollinated. So these things, if there's someone else growing mustard, they're going to cross. Once again, at this point in time, I don't know how many people are saving mustard all the way to seed. It really is going to depend on what your neighborhood looks like. So I have a very strong gardening neighborhood. So there's probably more of a probability that here than maybe in other places. I know my neighbor across the street is Nepalese, and she has a Nepalese mustard. So if I'm growing mustard, you know, I always check with her because I know what she's growing is really special to her, and I don't want mine to cross with hers. So that's also kind of when it's again knowing your neighbors and what people are growing. Let's see. Okay, so and then these are other things that are insect pollinated as well. The broccoli rabe, the Chinese cabbage, all of these things, you know, needing a little bit of a larger population size. The rutabaga is only one. Great. Once again, how many people are really growing rutabagas? So probably not going to cross-pollinate with there are different varieties of rutabagas, but probably most people only grow kind of a common one, and not many people are letting it go to sacrifice and go to seed. So you also have to kind of weigh that into your mix of like, is it likely to cross with other rutabagas? Probably not, because probably no one's doing that. And what's in a name? So this is why, once again, we talked about knowing the scientific name. And once again, there are a different couple of different mustards. So knowing those, you can actually grow 2 different mustards and save them both if they're different species of mustards. One of the common ones to be aware of is carrots. So you really, with your carrots, this is one of those few things that I would say be really careful about accepting into your seed library. So the carrots, why I would be a little bit more wanting to know who saved them and their process is for a couple reasons. One, Queen Anne's lace is Daucus carota, and that's the same scientific name as the edible carrots. So obviously, if Queen Anne's lace is growing in your area, probably not good it won't be poisonous, but it just will be woody and inedible. Same thing as I mentioned, if someone started with anything that was a hybrid carrot, that could also be a problem because it could have introduced some male sterility into the mix. And then the other thing is carrots need a population size. Carrots have not been in cultivation as long as some of the other crops that we eat. And as a result, the genetic diversity is a lot more limited. And if you save from a small population, it can have severe inbreeding depression in a year. And so within a year, it can actually revert to kind of something more like Queen Anne's lace. Oh, there we go. How can I save carrots? Probably don't. I wouldn't say they don't, because I do save carrots. In fact, I've got carrots. Where are my carrots? There's my carrots right here. So Daisy. Okay, so in my school garden, as I said, once again, it's a school garden, so it has to go over winter. Once again, I'm living in the San Francisco Bay Area, so we don't have a freeze. The soil doesn't freeze, and so the carrots can stay in the ground. If you have an area that freezes, you've got to pull the carrots out of the ground, which we're not going to go into because it's more than any normal gardener is going to do. You need a large population so they don't inbreed. 50, that is crazy. And you can't eat any of them. So that's also crazy. So once again, you could plant several different kind of open pollinated varieties. So I don't need 50, maybe I need 12. And then that can produce a lot of seed. They will get very big. And then when they dry, they'll be like this. And they are little, the carrot seeds you get in the store, they've cleaned them, but these are very prickly. So just know when you do deal with carrot seeds, you want to wear a mask and probably gloves because they're super prickly. So, and sorry about the light. I had to sit in here because they were doing construction outside of my house. And now the light is beaming in here, but just where we are today. And then also, as I said, knowing the scientific name, beets and chard are both Beta vulgaris. And so if you plant beet and chard and let both of them flower, they will cross-pollinate. I don't know if you're going to get more chard structure or more beet structure. Once again, if you want to do varietal purity, these are wind pollinated. The pollen can travel for a long time, but then also asking yourself who, and they have to overwinter. So who really is letting their beet or chard go overwinter all the way to seed, to flower and seed? Probably not that many people. So if you could probably, what we do in our school garden is 1 year we do beets and then another year we do chard. And that kind of and we just do them in different beds so that we know that we don't all of a sudden have it like some seeds that dropped in from chard from the previous year where there's now beets, and kind of introduce that into the mix. So that's another way to do it, is just one species 1 year and another species another year, and do different beds so you don't have accidental seeds. And that's something to think about with some of the things, is not to have accidental seeds show up either in the soil if you're trying to maintain purity, or on your seed cleaning screens, that you have something kind of in there that gets into the mix. Corn. So my seed teacher he was always talking about corn is very promiscuous. If there is a corn plant anywhere around, it will find you. So I remember years ago, I got some corn at a swap and I was all excited about it. And then I just was like, it was coming out with all these different, I was like, that is not at all what I planted. And they're just like, yeah, if there's corn anywhere around, the pollen, because it's wind pollinated, it can travel a long distance, it will find your plant. What's interesting about what about corn? Well, it also has a very large population size. So that's kind of a big discourager for many people. But, you can mix it up like Julia does and have a smaller population size that's manageable. So that's one strategy. One thing that's interesting, if you were trying to maintain genetic purity and you do have more space, is that corn exhibits this thing called the zinnia effect, where on the mother plant. So normally with a plant, if you save the seed, so I have my Costata romanesco plant. I was all excited about saving the seeds, but I didn't hand pollinate it. And the next year when I go to plant it, it's like, whoa, wow, this doesn't at all look like a Costata romanesco. And it's because most plants, when you save the seeds, it will still look like that on the mother plant, but the next year is when you'll find out that there was a cross on the, in the zucchini or whatever. Whereas corn is very interesting, and it will show that cross in the mother plant. So I can see that this cross, so it was a yellow corn, and then all of a sudden you've got all these like red markers showing up. And I think red is the dominant gene, would be my guess based on that. So potatoes. So if you are interested in growing potatoes, we don't really do it by seed, although Julia does, and she can talk a little bit about it, is if you do grow potatoes, you would want to get disease certified potatoes from things. But with Carol Deppy, the How to Breed Your Own Vegetables, she talks about that she's very concerned about us having a potato blight that comes through, and then a lot of people don't save potato seed. So if you do save potatoes, at the top of the potato, when it flowers, it will actually develop these little balls, and inside the little balls, that's the fruit, will be seeds, and you can save those. And Julia, do you want to say anything about it? Because I know you offer potato seeds through your Going to Seed project.
I have been breeding potatoes for a few years, and it's really rewarding with the colors and the shapes and the all, the ways that seed potatoes grow. It's just a challenge. So I would totally recommend it for any potato lover.
And what's cool about the potatoes is if you wanting to like create an heirloom of the future, with a lot of these heirlooms, if you're trying to create a new variety, it's going to take probably 7 years for you to keep, over year after year stabilize. Like, oh, I'm selecting for that. I'm selecting for that. I'm selecting for that, and keep like telling the plant over and over again. And finally, after 7 or so years, you get a stable variety. Whereas with potatoes, because you're saving the tubers the next year, you get like insta stable variety. So you plant a potato seed, you like that one, you save some of those tubers, and you can all of a sudden be like, I've got my own like Julia Dakin, purple tomato or purple potato. So you can be insta saver. And then just the last thing, if you are saving for purity and something shows in your mix that you don't want, you would rogue it out. So for example, this was this Crocoviensia that I was saving, and all of a sudden out of nowhere came this little oak leaf. So it's like you just pull out that, so you eat it before it can go to seed and add the genetics into the mix. So it's an easy way with gardeners. You just like eat what you don't want to save the seed from. And just kind of overall, the seed saving protocol is save from healthy plants, save from as many plants as you possibly can, and isolate things that cross-pollinate if you're trying to maintain that thing. Label as much information as you can. And if you bring back seeds that don't, so maybe, for example, you have something that's really rare and unusual, but it wasn't super healthy, then you would want to label that. It's just saying, this is really important. This is great Aunt the Italian pole bean, but it just didn't do really well, but it's really important. So for this reason, because here's this cool story behind it. So just make sure you're communicating. And then when you are putting the seeds in the seed library or in your own collection, make sure that they're dry and clean. I didn't mention it, but I want to put it out there. Peas and beans can get weevils. So if you have pea or beans, put them in the freezer for a week so you kill any of those, because there have been some very sad stories of people that have, I mean, I know for myself, I had one year I went and opened my jar of great Aunt Racie's Italian pole bean, and there were just shells. Everything had been eaten. And then I've also heard very sad stories of like the Pima County Seed Library that pooled. They did a one seed, one community where everyone was growing the same important, seed in the Southwest together, and they pooled all their seeds together, and someone or some people's seeds were infected with bean weevils. And the next year when they went to share them out, there was nothing left. They had all been eaten. So peas and beans in the freezer for 1 week. You don't need to store them in the freezer otherwise, but it's just to kill the eggs. And then we will share out with you a seed viability chart, just so you can, as you're going through your own collection or you're going through your seed library collection, you can see, oh, arugula lasts for about 5 years. Okay, oh, this seed is from 2021, still good for, a little bit of time. So this will be a chart that we share out with you in a couple of days. And then, as I mentioned, like including on the envelope what to include, uses, habits, is it pure, is it crossed? If you know what the possible crosses are, include that in there. And then, as I mentioned, like be clear on your purpose for saving. Is it traditional variety or biodiversity, food security, climate resilience? And we've said it many, many times. Label, mark across. And I love what my seed teacher said, when we're seed saving, a lot of people are so like nervous about it. Like, oh, I'm going to make a mistake. He's like, let us eat our mistakes. As long as you didn't plant ornamental gourds or there's Queen Anne's lace around, you're probably good to go. So eat our mistakes. Okay. And I think from here, I'm going to just open it up to some questions and then you'll get the last bit, but there's some little bonus slides in there. But if people have some questions, I think that's probably a better way to use our last bit of time.
I have not seen any questions except
Well,
Pastor Barrow. Do beans exhibit the zinnia effect?
I don't think so. I think it's just corn.
Yeah.
Just corn.
Any other questions? Now is a good time, and if not, we'll jump into something. All right, should I do a squash species explanation?
You can do that while people are writing their questions, and I can also do some of the answering questions. Oh, and Michael, if you want to put in, or Pat, some of the other information from the thing, that'd be great. Ooh, what germination rate is acceptable? Good question. I think it's good to, if you know the germination rate, to put it, but sometimes we'll also just say low germination rate, plant extra. And then like the next year, pull it. Like, and we got the survey going on. Okay. Okay, go for it, Julia. Why don't you share your little.
Okay. All right. But definitely keep adding your questions, and I can only take, I'll take 5 minutes on this. And if, all right. So squash species. There are 3 main ones, and they don't cross-pollinate with each other, which maybe is obvious to you guys, but so this will be a review, but to some people it might be new or empowering. So this Machata species is the butternut is the most common. Long Island cheese, Dickinson, Mosqueda Provence, Seminole. Oops. These are all varieties within the species, and they will cross-pollinate with each other. But Machata doesn't cross with, anything in the pepo species. So zucchini, you can plant zucchini and butternut right next to each other, and they will not cross. And I am curious from you guys, how many people already have this down, and how many people where it's a good review, or, you're learning it for the first time. Curious. So how to tell them apart? The Machata species has this narrow stem, usually ridged, 5-sided, and flared. So next time you're in the grocery store, just check out the stems, look at the different stems. And the seeds look like this. They look very different from Maxima, the other winter squash species, and they look somewhat similar to Pepo, but they have this little ridge around the edge. So if you get a seed contribution, you can often tell what species it is. And Maxima, most colorful and delicious. So these are the beautiful roaster types that are all typically, these varieties are usually bred to be tasty. So the buttercups, Hubbard, kabocha, banana, red curry, sweet meat, they're all delicious. So that's why, mixing it up, going on the wild ride with squash, Maxima is pretty much the safest one to do that with. And how to tell them apart is these stems. So the stem on the left, it's really like a large spongy stem. It's not ridged, it's not that hard. That's the distinctive thing about Maximas. And the seeds are bigger. They can be brown or white, but they tend to be bigger and smoother, kind of more like puffy than the other species. And yes, so stems are the main thing with Maxima, and also all those beautiful colors. So Pepo, right? Pepo is the most challenging species. It's very, very diverse. All the summer squash, but then also winter squash too. So this is the list of varieties or types in the Pepo species: zucchini, patty pan, yellow summer squash or crookneck squash, pumpkins, acorn squash, delicata, holeless pumpkins, and spaghetti squash. Super cool, but also really challenging. So a lot of times I just tell people, especially if they're beginners, just keep buying your Pepo species.
And you said also the ornamental gourd is in this species.
I think I have a slide just for ornamental gourd. So this bitter squash syndrome is in the Pepo species, and I mentioned that earlier. There was a story from my local community where they cooked up all the decorative gourds after Halloween at a senior center, and The soup is really bitter, but a couple people just powered through it and decided they wanted to be polite and eat it, and they got very sick. So it matters. This is a bitter antioxidant that's not good for you. So how you tell this species apart, these stems are also distinctive. They're somewhat similar, especially when dried to Moschata, but you can definitely tell them apart by their colors, right? The Moschata tend to be the tan colors, and Pepos are much more diverse also with those stems, but more flared in their stems. And the seeds are small. They don't have that distinctive line, but it takes a little practice to tell the Pepo seeds and the Moschata seeds apart. So that is it. And just a Pepo reminder, right? All these winter squash are also Pepos. So when seed saving in my particular community, I instruct people to keep those winter squash separated from the summer squash. And we accept summer squash seeds, but as long as, you know, you kept the others with at least 100 feet away. And that's it.
Awesome. Yeah. And one thing just to remember was when you are saving the Peppo summer squash, you have to let it go all the way till it's a winter squash. So the seeds will not be ready. I mean, one year, I mean, I mentioned it, I had this massive zucchini. It was turning orange. I was all excited about it. And, you know, I wanted to get something else in the ground, and I pulled it out thinking, oh, it's ready. It's like, look how big it is. And it's like hard. And I cut it, I dried the seeds, and they were all paper thin. And I was so bummed because I just like, that was it. That was the one I was saving, and I lost it. And so it's worthwhile just letting, if you are saving the summer squash, letting it go until the plant dies, and you're like, okay, plant is dead. There's no more juice going to that thing. It's, you know, the seeds are going to be good. Yeah.
Yeah. And then you can even let it cure longer. So the longer you let those squash cure, the better seed quality.
And what would you recommend in terms of, so I just right now had some of the Moschatas from the project from your seeds. How long? And the plant just died. And I'm just going to I'm going to pull them in now that they just finished the stucco. They're actually still here. The stucco guys are still just wrapping up. How long would you let them?
So for curing for winter squash, they say 3 weeks in a warm, like 70 degrees. And then after that in cool storage. I mean, it's not always possible for people, but I would like as long as possible, but at least a few weeks.
Okay. Sounds awesome. Any other questions? And once again, we will be emailing you resources. I did put in a link to the census. So if you have an open seed library and are not on our seed library map, we would love to get you on our map. So please do that. And then Michael, thank you, put in the form, just kind of to give us some feedback. This is the first time we have taught this class together. And so I really appreciate Julia joining for this. Yay, yay, yay. And so if you have any other last questions, this is your time to ask them.
And I have a question. I'm just curious how many people are thinking of increasing diversity, adding any diverse mixes. So yeah, curious about you guys.
Yeah.
And Pat already does.
Pat's Pat's doing the same project that we're doing with Julia. But I have to say, it's so, I mean, for years, you know, I mean, I teach a class on seed saving, you know, like this book, and did that for years. And, you know, sometimes it's like, you just get a whole bunch of lettuce and it's just like, it's the lettuce mix, because most people like lettuce mixes anyway. So why am I going through all this, like having 20 different varieties of lettuce in the collection where, like, yeah, there's one or two in there that are super special, and I periodically will grow them out separately to make sure that continues to stay in the mix because it's rare. But a lot of it's also just like, okay, most people just want to mix and are going to take a pinch of anything anyway. So, and it makes it a lot easier for seed librarians to manage their collection. And you can always say what the parentage is and then just add things in that are interesting So kind of a both and, yeah, so both yes and approach. This is kind of the improv for dealing with the planet right now and the bottleneck we are in terms of genetic diversity. So once again, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate you taking the time out to be part of this. We are excited to hear what you do in your own community around seed saving and which adventure or adventures you decide to go on. Once again, we really recommend getting The Seed Garden is a great book. The book, Julia will put it in, you can get it from Going to Seed, Joseph Lofthouse, Landrace Gardening, if you want to be. And then also Organic Seed Alliance has really great references as well about seed saving. We are building out right now the seed library website. So we'll have a more user-friendly interface, which will be coming out in the next kind of couple of weeks. And we'll be putting kind of the seed saving resources on there. So you can point the people in your community to that so that you're not having to do all of that yourself. And we'll probably be pointing to other people like Seed Savers Exchange and stuff like that. So really trying to figure out where some of the really key resources are around seed saving so that we can do it in community and you can share with people in your community so we can all do this and save the genetic diversity, because we are in a big time of change right now. And that diversity is going to be stewarded by people like you and your seed library, which is super, super important. Yay. Julia, last words, my dear.
No, thanks everyone for coming. I'm just typing out a comment, and it's exciting
Okay.
to be here. And I hope you guys fill out the survey and maybe we can connect tomorrow.